Uh, Speaking of which, we've got coming up Brian Rinaldi. He's the developer experience engineer at Launch Darkly with over 20 years experience on the web. He's also really involved in the community. He's down in Orlando and organizes Orlando Devs and CFE.dev local meetups. He's the editor of Jamstack newsletter, co-author of the Jamstack book from Manning. There's more jam in this jar than I could possibly make bad jokes about. So I will stop and turn it over to you, Brian. It is really good to meet you, and happy to have you here. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. I love being at Web Unleashed as well. I have a long history with Web Unleashed. Funny enough, it started off as an event I ran. And speaking of flash in the can, this was once a flash and flex event. Yeah, that's what I started it as. Anyway, I am here not to talk about Flash. Thank goodness. I'm here to talk about feature flags. So I've got my slides up here. Hold on a sec. I was workshopping some names here. This is actually, you might have checked the schedule. This is not the right name. Sorry, I'm just going to flip that. Okay, got the right name. All right. So, except, I kind of think like the slides look kind of plain. I've been working on this, trying to improve the look of these slides. So let me flip that there. All right. Looking a little better now, but I think I can do a little bit better. I was testing out some backgrounds and things like that. I think the slides would look really good with some background. So let me flip that. Okay, now we're good. Now we're good to go. All right, so I'm here to talk to you about feature flags beyond the Boolean. Basically, I want to get beyond just kind of like simplistic feature flagging. But what we're going to cover, because a lot of you may be like, okay, I've heard of feature flags, but I actually haven't used them. Or maybe you're just starting to get familiar with using feature flags and haven't really thought beyond the basics. So we're going to talk about what feature flags are, why they are really useful. We're going to talk about implementing a standard feature flag, as well as advanced flag types and flag usages. So not to repeat everything that was said before, I am a developer experience engineer at Launch Darkly. We do feature flags as a service, essentially. That's kind of the quick 10-second pitch there. So I also did the Jamstack book from Manning, Jamstack newsletter from Cooper Press. I'm deep in Jam, and I run a community online called CFE.dev. We actually have online meetups every other week, sometimes every week, depending. We got one even Thursday if you want to join. And I run Orlando Devs here in Orlando. If you are in the Orlando area, I'd love to meet you. So, what the heck are feature flags? So sometimes we call them toggles, but essentially it's a very simple concept. It's a way of saying, turn on this piece of code. Like it's basically a conditional that says like, if true, run this code. If not true, don't run this code. And it allows you to like kind of block off a feature in development, or really any kind of code. It doesn't have to necessarily be a feature in development. If the condition is true, that code is run. If the condition is false, the code is not run. So as kind of a more crisp example here, I've got this little flag I created like, oh, okay, if my flag is true, then I'm going to have this feature here. And if my flag is false, the feature is gone. So some people would see it, some people might not. And then you might be thinking, okay, that's super simple. It's just the basic conditional. What's the big deal? I've even had people, because this is what we do at Launch Darkly, I've had people come up to me and I can't believe they made a whole company out of this. And that's where it's like, okay, once you get past the very, very basics of what a feature flag is, things got to start to get a little more complicated. But it is still a big deal. One thing is code can be turned on in one environment and not in others. This is really important. I can be working on a feature, and that feature is working in my local development environment. But then when that code is pushed even to dev, maybe I don't want people to use it yet because it's not ready, or it might break something. So I can block that off and it's not in there, or it's definitely not going to be showing in production if it's not ready. It separates deploy from release. And this is a really, really big core concept. We're so used to thinking in the sense of as soon as I deploy code, that code is released. But with feature flags, that changes the whole story. I can deploy code, but that code is not running. That code is not actually released yet. And I can then decide when is the appropriate time to release it based on whatever criteria. We want to go through certain tests, or we want to release it to a beta group. And we'll talk more about those concepts in a bit, because that is a critical aspect to feature flagging. And this is also another big kind of killer feature, which is that you can kill a feature anytime that it's malfunctioning. So instead of having to pull back an entire release and figure out what went wrong, you can actually just turn off the feature that's broken and enable things to keep going without. That's like immediate and solves the problem, and then I can fix whatever was broken in the background without having to kind of roll everything back. So that brings up the concept of trunk-based development. And it may not be like, I'm a front-end developer, and I think a lot of these concepts came more from DevOps and things like that. So I'll admit, like, some of these things were very new to me when I joined LaunchDarkly, but I think it's really relevant for front-end developers. So as a developer, I've often we start branching things, and those branches might live for a couple of days. They might live for a week or 2 weeks, or it might even live for months, depending on how long it takes me to actually build that feature. Sometimes, what I think it's going to take, it ends up taking much longer. So I either have to keep synchronizing my changes with the main branch, or even if I do, I may still end up dealing with a complicated merge at the end. And having to deal with merge conflicts and stuff like that, that's just can be really painful and problematic. Trunk-based development says, no, we're just gonna constantly merge into the main branch, and those features will live there, but even if they're not complete, they're not necessarily running. And that's where feature flags play a key role in this concept of trunk-based development. So we are constantly merging things into main and working off the main, or even just working straight off the main branch. Those changes will get deployed, but they're not necessarily released. So we eliminate these long-running branches, we eliminate the merge conflicts, and it's a great way to kind of keep, do tons of deploys and move really fast without having the problems of long-running features, feature branches, and all of that. So basic toggle implementation. So a basic feature flag implementation. A lot of times when people they start really simple. They're like, okay, well, I can do this. I could just throw a variable in my file. And if that variable is true, I will run that code. And if that variable is false, I won't. And then I can have it true in my local development environment. And then I will turn it to false in the other environments. But you can see how this really isn't that sustainable. It's problematic in that I have to make sure that I have the right variable set in different environments. It's also problematic in that if that flag applies to multiple files, I have to have that variable in those multiple files. There's no central place to track where these variables are, where the flags are, and what they do. So it's really not a sustainable way of implementing feature flags, but it's often a way people start. And then we might say, okay, well, you know what? I'm going to externalize the values for that so that I can actually run it from the command line. I'm going to start my application, and I'll pass the flags that I want turned on and off when I initialize. That way I can say, like, in my local environment or in my dev environment, I might say, turn these flags on, but then in production, they're defaulted to off, and we don't have a problem, right? So all those features that I don't want you to see yet are automatically turned off. This, though, works really only for a limited set of flags, because you can see how this could become, like, once you have a lot of flags and you start using flags continuously, you're going to have a really complicated set of commands here. It's going to be hard to really share that among your team if everybody's creating their own flags. There's no central place, again, to find the flags that you're using. So it's a workable solution as a way to start, but as you start using them more, it gets complicated. So this is really the most common way I've seen people do feature flagging when they have a homegrown solution, which is that they move everything to a configuration file, like a YAML file that sits in the root of my project that has my list of flags. it gives me a nice central place for all of the team to go and find, okay, here are all the flags. I can kind of, if I have a good naming strategy, I might easily be able to figure out what they do, or I can even add comments to tell you what they do. I can do things like it doesn't have to be easily true, false now. I can get to more complicated flags. Like I can have strings and numbers, and even I can do full objects as a flag. So because a flag, again, doesn't have to be just a Boolean. So this is kind of the common way to do it. A lot of times when I talk to people doing this, one of the troubles with this strategy is that it still requires a redeploy to actually push those changes. So I need to go in, change the configuration file, turn off a flag. So like it's not easy to do like a kill switch, because if I need to change that, I need to push that change in the configuration to production and things like that. So it's an unnecessary delay in being able to do things like that. Some people then move into like, okay, well, the next step would be, okay, then I'm going to move it into a data store of some sort, and that's where I'm going to get my flags. Again, that's also a great way to do your own implementation. You do start to get into additional complications in that you have to say, okay, well, I need to push those changes. If I flip that flag, it needs to be pushed to my application, so my application immediately receives it and responds to it, and things like that. Maybe then I make an admin that allows people out code, say project owners and such, to be able to change flags rather than have to get a developer involved with changing the flag. And then you've ended up building LaunchDarkly yourself. But but okay, we've only covered basic flags, Boolean flags, and I know this talk is about going beyond that, but Boolean flags are actually really powerful. You could do a lot with just a Boolean flag. So there's all different types of toggles that you can create using them. There's release toggles, which is like basically I have a code that's in my production code base, but it's not running. So I can decide like, okay, this feature is not ready to release. Then we can go through testing, maybe release it to certain groups. Then we can fully release it. And that release toggle determines when that release happens, even though the code is deployed. There are ops toggles, which I can say swap to a new service if I'm switching backend services. I've seen toggles used to switch databases, to upgrade a whole like infrastructure, used to kind of keep people like slowly move people into a new infrastructure. So those would be more like what we call ops toggles. Again, we've talked about kill switches, which is really just having certain features have a flag around them so that in case there's a problem, we can easily just flip that off. And that usually goes, you kind of get granular because you want to be able to just not turn off the entire release. We may have multiple features in a release. We want to be able to target the particular feature that has a problem. So again, there are different options for flags. We talked a lot about like homegrown. Obviously, there's LaunchDarkly, which you know which one I prefer. And there are lots of other services which I won't necessarily go over here, because the thing is, I work for LaunchDarkly, of course, but I'm not here really to sell you on LaunchDarkly. I want you to actually buy into the concept of using feature flags. But my demos will use LaunchDarkly because that's what I use. I am going to show you any code I show you is going to be plain JavaScript, but pretty much any tool you use for feature flagging, if you choose to use a tool like LaunchDarkly or one of the others that are available, have support for different frameworks like React and Vue. And they may provide you with SDKs to make this really easy to integrate. So I am going to just show you quickly how you would actually get started with this using LaunchDarkly, so you can kind of get the gist of how easy it is to kind of integrate with an external service like LaunchDarkly. In the case of LaunchDarkly, we provide you an SDK, and the SDK you just have to initialize, and all you do, when you're talking front end code, all you provide is the client ID. So we have server side IDs and we have client IDs. I won't get deep into that. It's just you have to understand the difference between, on the client side, I can actually see what's coming and going, whereas on the server side, we have more flexibility to send more data because, well, I can't intercept that data. So that's kind of the basic gist of why we separate those two things. But this would be how you initialize on the client, and then I pass a user object. So a user object is really, we call it a user object, but it's really anything. User could be like a machine. It's basically any arbitrary data that I want to be able to target by. And we'll get into what targeting is in a little bit. And then I just wait for that SDK client to say it's ready. Once it's ready, then I can start getting flag values. So in this case, I'm saying like, get me the variation, which is the current value of this flag for that particular user object. And the next value here, this false. And basically it's a default that I can provide. So the SDK has lots of ways of making sure that nothing ever goes down if ever there's a problem. First of all, it caches things locally on the client. But then if it hasn't, let's say you initialized it and for whatever reason at that very moment, the service is down and you don't want your code to break because of that. So like in this case, I can provide a default value. So there's multiple layers of protection for like this ever breaking your code. So let's get into some of the like other uses where we're talking again beyond the Boolean uses. So you can have different types of flags. The interesting thing once you get beyond a Boolean is with string, number, and JSON flags is that they can have multiple variations, as we call them multivariate flags. They don't just have to have two variations. We can have any number of variations which allow you to do different things using flags rather than just turn things on and off. But we're going to start with a little bit of on and off magic here. So string flags are good for configurations or content. I got a little image here that I've tied to a flag, and I can just flip that flag here and change that image. This could be like, okay, I want to be able to change text on the page like I did on the title screen, or I want to change some kind of configuration. Maybe I'm passing, what connection string or any number of things. Really, their string values can do a lot that way. I'm not going to cover number values because that basically works the same as string values. You just can have multiple variations. Obviously, if it's a numeric value, you use a number one as opposed to a string. But JSON flags are good for like complex configurations. So as an example, beyond kind of my simplistic example here, which I'll show you in a moment, we had a whole, when we launched our new branding and everything, there was a configuration that was in a flag that actually changed the whole site to give the new branding look and a new logo and everything, all the new CSS. So that was all held in flags. So you can do really complex things. In this case, you can also do like structured content that way. So in this case, I've done some structured content here. So if I flip, you can see my JSON flag here. I've just, if I go into here, the various variations, I've got just two variations here on or off, which have my JSON object. That's a simple JSON object, but it can be as complex as you want it to be. Oh, I didn't flip it. Let's flip it for fun because that's fun. Structured JSON. Ooh. There we go. There we go. Okay. Yeah, we got our Batman. So we can have like, okay, maybe I target this to specifically employees in the company can only see the secret identity of our CEO. Anyway. All right, so those were all just very simple on-off flags, but I want to get into where it gets really more powerful and more interesting, which is that flags don't have to be on or off for everyone at the same time. They can have different values for different people, and that's where we get into this concept of targeting. I told you a little bit about the user object before and being able to pass arbitrary information that I want to be able to target by, so we're going to show you some use cases for that. One thing is this idea of canary releases or progressive rollouts. So canary releases, like I have the production release ready, and I want to slowly move people over to it. making sure that everything's holding up as I do that. Progressive rollout is basically the same thing. Usually, canary release is like a full separate release. A progressive rollout might be more like I have the feature in my production code and I turn it on slowly for different people. So I've got some code here that's doing that. Essentially what I got to turn it on here. I'm going to show you this progressive rollout. This is a very, very simplistic one where I've set it now to just 50-50. I could actually roll that out, say, I could even create a workflow that does 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 slowly as I verify that everything's working right. So I've got two string values here that are set to 50-50. If I turn this flag back on, we will start to target. Why? Okay, there we go. Right. So when I do that, this now will show 50% will get one string value for this and 50% will get another. What I'm doing here is I'm going to change the user, and you can see it changes. It's not going to change every single time because this is a random 50%. So that it's kind of like flipping a coin. Sometimes you get heads over and over again. You see I've got a few times in a row, but now I get the other variation. And so you'll see like this could be somebody coming to the site and they want 50% would see one version, 50% another. And I could make sure that everything works before I keep increasing that percentage and eventually rolling it out fully, then and it's fully released, right? Just to kind of give you a sense of what's going on under the hood there, so you don't think I'm like pulling any trickery. All I'm doing is I'm actually setting a random user. Again, this user doesn't, normally you wouldn't just target by the user ID here, but because a progressive rollout would be randomized, I don't necessarily, typically I might just arbitrarily assign 10%. This Launch Darkly will do that for you. In this case, I'm just kind of randomly sending it a new user so I can see how that targeting works. Another one is where you might want to do a user or segment tracking, where you're like targeting, where I'm targeting specific groups of users or individual users or things like that. Like I've seen this in particular used for like, I might have a beta group of users that I target using this. And in this case, I'm going to turn this on. I'm going to show you, in this case, I'm doing individual user targeting, which is probably not the most effective way to do this. I would probably want to use a segment, but it's not what I'm doing. I'm doing the simple way. So, oops, I didn't save that. There we go. So I'm going to turn that on so we can do that here. So in this case, if I'm logged in as me, you saw that I was a user, I can see one version. But if I'm logged in as anybody else, like Cody, my boss, he sees the other version, or Tom might see everybody else except Brian gets the version. And I can do this again for single users or groups, but I can target a particular version. And maybe I want to create my test, like a group for our testing team, or a group for our product owners, or even I could have multiple groups and slowly add those as I roll this out to different people. Or even you can, I've seen it used for things like targeting. I have compliance issues that are only relevant in Europe, so I'm going to target anybody in EMEA with this particular variation. So in this case, I've got a simple experiment. This is where it gets like, you can do things like A/B testing, which gets really fun. That one's already on. I'm gonna show you how that looks. This one, I've got 3 variations. They're split evenly across a third of the users. I've also got this experiment going on, but let's show you this running. I'm gonna change the user, and you can see, of course, this is gonna do different things. Now, what it's tracking here, I'm actually tracking if somebody clicks this, and if they click it, then if I go to my experiment, I'm start slowly trying to figure out which of these buttons is the most useful. Obviously, you can do this for anything. This is a very simple example just to illustrate, but you can see in my results, it starts to predict which of these variations is going to be the most effective for me. So I can do things like that. So again, we're getting beyond like kind of just using feature flags as, yes, turn this on, turn this off because the feature's not ready. Now we're actually using feature flags to determine whether this feature is a good feature. Instead of just releasing the feature and then after the fact saying, okay, was that even worth doing because people aren't using it? No, we can test this out before. So that's basic experimentation. So now I want to get into quickly one quick concept about flag debt, which is that once you start doing all these really cool things with flags, you start to have a lot of flags throughout your code. And we call this flag debt because what happens is you start having flags that maybe aren't useful anymore, that are still in your code. And it's important to think about when you're creating these flags, like the different types of flags that you might have from a how long they're expected to live standpoint. That way you can easily start to organize your flags, maybe and have naming convention or something that helps you determine whether a flag you need to go through and remove a flag. We do these periodically, even internally. We go through whole processes where we archive, we call them archivathons. Basically, they go through and they archive old flags and remove them from the code, and then remove them, archive them, and launch Darkly. But you have different kinds of flags. So you have like short-lived flags, or oh yeah, I'm releasing a feature. It might not be ready yet, so I'm gonna go ahead and flag that until it's ready. Then we might go through some testing, and then once it's ready, it's fully released to everybody. That flag should disappear. We should remove it from the code and archive it and launch Darkly. That flag has a very short life. It may only be days, or it may be a couple of weeks, but it's going to have a very short life. And once it's past its usefulness, we can get rid of it. Longer lived flags might be something like if you're doing A/B testing, or even you're doing a progressive rollout that's extended, or different other uses like that, where you're going to have this flag around for maybe months or something, and those flags you're eventually still going to archive, but they're going to stick around for a while until this testing is done, or whatever use that you're using them for is over. And then you have actual like permanent flags, which as I've used the example of enabling beta access using a flag by assigning a segment of users to my beta group. Well, that flag probably isn't going to go away, because I'm always going to have people kind of going in and out of that beta group. I want that flag to stick around. So that's a permanent flag, and I need to make sure that like that doesn't get archived, right? So a lot of this is around thinking about the flags that you're creating ahead of time, giving some thought to like how you name them, so it's easy to identify and find flags that should be archived, and things like that. And as another aside, we do have tools within Launch Darkly, and other providers I'm sure have something similar, where we help to try and surface up flags that probably need to be archived because they haven't been used in a while, because we check to see like when was the last time a flag was used, or we can even help you identify where it is in the code so you can remove it, things like that. So the last little section here I want to get into is about using kind of the more fun. This part's more fun to me. I love this idea of the edge. I've kind of been experimenting with serverless edge computing, and you can actually use flags in those environments, and it can be really, really cool. So we're going to talk, for those of you who don't know, serverless edge is like basically, let's think of like a Lambda or a serverless function that's running at the CDN level. Key difference here, though, is that rather than being the endpoint, the edge function will intercept the request coming in, and then intercept the response going out. So I can either make changes to the request or make changes to the response. And this is a really great place to do some flag integration. Like, for instance, intercepting the request, I can do edge redirects, which will then, rather than doing server-side redirects, or even worse, client-side redirects, I can do the redirect at the edge. So maybe even I'm like doing a canary release and I'm pointing them at a different version of the site, or based on a flag or something like that. I can do that at the edge, and then there's no latency involved with that. I can do flag injection, which I'll show in a moment, which is basically like, okay, so it's only like it's a 20 millisecond startup time for the SDK, but that 20 milliseconds is not nothing. But I can actually completely eliminate that by injecting the flags at the edge, and I'll show you how that works in just a moment. Or that A/B testing we're talking about, rather than changing content client side, or even having to like change content server side. Maybe the page is statically rendered. I want to actually change that content when the response is coming back at the edge based on whatever group you're assigned to. We're going to go ahead and modify that content and then send it back to you without any latency involved, no flash of rendering or anything like that. So here's a basic flag injection. This is what this is doing. This is on Cloudflare workers. What this is doing is essentially intercepting any request, and it's going to inject the flags, all the client-side flag values. So here, I'm initializing LaunchDarkly as with an anonymous user, just for the case of example. This could be, again, I could provide whatever user details I want here. And then I'm going to get all flags, but I'm only getting client-side flags because these are the flags I want injected into the client. And then I'm going to append a script tag that has the flags saved to a variable, the whole flag structure saved to a variable. And what this allows me to do is actually bootstrap LaunchDarkly using this window.ld flags, so that it doesn't have to go and check LaunchDarkly for the values, wait for the client to start up and pull the values down. It actually gets them immediately, bootstraps them. It's available as soon as you start. There's no flash of rendering. There's no lag in 20 millisecond lag in starting up the client. It's all right away. And then as soon as it connects to LaunchDarkly, it'll start streaming any changes that happen. But these are the latest flags. These are not like, oh, we're just kind of putting a cache of flags. These are the latest flags. As soon as that request is made, I'm injecting them every single time, whatever the latest values are. So to kind of give you a very, very simple example, again, of how you might do this for A/B testing. Let's say I want to replace the header text. I'm A/B testing different header text. I'm going to use an HTML rewriter. And this is basically get flag value is I wrote a little like server-side wrapper for the Node.js SDK that just makes it a little bit easier for me to get some flag values and initialize users and stuff like that. So that's why you're not seeing all of that here. But essentially, I'm saying, okay, get me the flag value for the header text, and then every time when I hit that H1 element, I'm going to replace that header text with the A/B test. Again, a simple example. I would probably want to target a specific element on the page, not just every H1 element on the page. But for the case of example, that's the kind of the simple way of showing it. So honestly, that is it for my examples. Hopefully I showed you some use cases that you hadn't really considered for feature flags, and maybe convince you that you should be using feature flags in your project, whether that's using them in some of those examples in like serverless written in JavaScript and in your backend Node.js or in your front end client. I think it's really powerful concept. You can find me on Twitter at RemoteSynth still, until maybe Twitter is dead this week. Who knows? And then, or you can email me, which that email will live past Elon Musk. So, all right. So yeah, that's it for me. I will turn it over for any questions.
That was awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. This being the first year or so that I've worked on a really large scale team at Chewy, for your bingo cards, there's another mention. I know that we do things to roll stuff out to small numbers of users and build up from there. I'm kind of jumping the line a little bit with some of the questions that we had in here. With something like this, I know it's easy to apply this to JavaScript that you're going to be rendering, but have you done this as well to sort of scope out and kind of control the CSS as well?
Yeah, we have done that internally. I haven't personally written anything that because if you saw my CSS, you'd be sad. So I haven't done that. But as an example, we did do that. When I told you about the rebranding, the example of the rebranding, we actually did do that where we applied entirely, like we actually had, I think, CSS variables that we set in and those would pull from a flag configuration and would change the whole look of the site. I don't know how they implemented that, to be honest. So I could ask the team if somebody. My DMs are open, so if you reach out to me on Twitter or the email that I provided, I'd be happy to reach out to the team to ask them how they did that configuration and change the CSS. I mean, at a simplistic level, you could actually just change what CSS you're including. But I think they did more complex where they actually passed colors, and so they could test out different color variations and things like that in a JSON object as a flag.
Right.
So
that's sort of that's kind of what I was thinking. I mean, we're shifting to use design tokens that are setting. They're originating in Figma and then actually rolling it out via JSON to create custom properties in CSS, and that was sort of the thing that I had in mind, was actually set it with the JavaScript that you've already scoped with the flag, and then actually that would sort of cascade down to badly make a pun intentionally about CSS itself. Okay, so that was awesome. We still have a few more minutes, so I wanted to ask you, once you've adopted the flags, you talked about flag debt a little bit, and so that was one of the things. One of the questions was what happens when your code is littered with all these flags. You talked a bit about flag debt. Albert actually chimed in from in the chat about once it gets to 100% rollout. But you pointed out some other scenarios, and so I know that this kind of a layered approach, but talk a little bit about what that cleanup process and sort of maintenance looks like on your team.
Yeah, so essentially, a lot of this is a little bit of upfront thinking. So like, we have, as an example, we have a particular way of naming flags that helps us identify which flags might be needed for archiving, and also easily identify what the flag's use is. So you want to make sure that you have like a naming convention set to make it clear, like, this is a flag that we intend to be short-lived, and what the use is, so we can easily identify and find flags. We can even within LaunchDarkly, you can even tag flags, for instance. So you can search for different groups of flags that are tagged with a similar tag. You can add descriptions and things like that to help you find those things. So what we run is like an occasional archive-a-thon where we go through and we just eliminate those flags. And we have like a whole team they set aside. I think it's just a day or an afternoon. I don't remember exactly how much. And they just sit there and they go through and they remove flags. Because as you can imagine, at LaunchDarkly, we use a lot of flags in our code. So yeah, we are like I'm not just I'm not the hair club for men kind of thing. I'm not just I'm not just the owner, I'm the client kind of thing. Like, we are probably our biggest client for feature flags. So I think a lot of it's just about setting up processes within your team to clean those up. As I said, there are ways to start to identify those. Like, for instance, I didn't really get into it, but we track events for all these flags, right? So we can tell you, oh, hey, that flag was actually last used, 5 days ago or 2 months ago, and we start to surface up flags that, hey, this one is old, you might want to consider archiving this flag. And so there are tools that kind of within the system that help you identify those. I think that's even one of those things, like we were talking a lot about homegrown and not homegrown. Like a homegrown system, you have to be very conscientious too about that, because you probably don't have a way of following, like, when was the last time this flag was actually called, unless you built the whole event system yourself. So those kind of tools help you do that. We also have a way of of searching your GitHub repo and finding the locations of flags. So that way, once you've identified a flag that might want to be archived, you can say, okay, well, where is this flag in my code? And it'll give you the code references, it's called, for where that flag has been used, to help you not just identify which flags are old, but where those flags are, so I can start to remove them. So it is an issue. and it's something that really I think any team adopting feature flags needs to think about. But it's also like, unbalanced, like the value you get over doing
Sure.
this and being able to like constantly release things and target users and things like that ends up being like just worth the little bit of flag net pain.
Sure. Well, what comes to mind for me in the way our teams are structured is that we've got teams working on different areas of the application. This feels like a sensible way to manage a more global rollout of something. So especially
Absolutely.
being on the design system team, we work on when we're working on some change to a component or a more global style like typography, for example, being able to effectively embargo that change until everybody has everything in place and then be able to roll it out, test it, roll it back if we need to, and actually see it more holistically really does sound like an incredibly powerful feature.
Yeah, and I didn't really even get into it, but one of the things once teams start to adopt this process more, that's I think is really really powerful in that sense is you might want to hand that over to a product owner, and so that's not a developer doesn't even need to be involved in releasing that. You say, okay, everything's ready, like we might have a day that we want to release it, and rather than have them say to the developer, okay, at this time go ahead and push that code or
Right.
flip the flag yourself or anything like that, you just say like, okay, it's up to you. This is, you're the product manager or whatever, you have access to these flags. It's pretty easy for them to understand, and they flip it themselves, or they manage, like you have a community manager who manages the beta group access by adding people to the segment. The point is you start to take some of these things that maybe shouldn't, we've asked developers to do, but probably isn't necessarily their core job. They're not the product owner, they're just implementing the feature. You can hand those off, and it really empowers other teams to be involved in the release process.
That's a great point. One of the things that somebody was asking, and I think these are actually, I'm going to tie these things together a little bit. First off, getting started. What's the kind of thing that would be a good starter flag? Like, what are some of the things that are good to kind of use to get your head around the concept?
Yeah, usually I think getting started is more like, okay, you start adopting it on, say, any new feature that I'm going to work on. I start putting flags around that code. So I'll create a flag for whatever, I may still be working in a branch, but I'll start flagging that code. So that way, when I merge it in, it's not necessarily like running. And that I don't know that there's a particular type of feature that works better or worse. It's just a matter of kind of adopting that, like, okay, from here on out I'm going to start trying to think about putting flags around stuff. I think when you start putting, I think mentally you start putting larger, kind of more comprehensive flags, like, okay, I'm going to put this one flag for this entire feature, and it's either on or off, right? And then you start kind of, as you get more advanced, you start breaking it down and say, okay, there's an overall flag for this feature, but then there's sub flags that are actually managing different pieces of that feature that maybe I want to be able to wrap independently. And so it's kind of a progression like that, but it really starts with just, okay, I'm going to start a new project and I'm going to throw a feature flag around any code related to this particular feature that I'm working on. And it doesn't matter, I think, whether it's front end, back end, whatever, design related. It's just it's more of a process thing than a code thing.
Right. Well, that's actually, that was really the follow-on question I was going to ask you, and I'm again kind of jumping the line a little bit. I want to get to Nikki's question in just a minute, but this is a big change for a team that is used to. I have this feature branch. We're doing our testing with this. That work is going on for a while. Then we're going through the PR process and bringing it back in and rebasing and doing all those other things that we have to do to once a feature branch has been around for too long. this is a big change because you're talking about actually getting this code back into that main branch much earlier in the process. That sounds like it would be scary for some teams.
Yeah, I think it is a little bit scary. I mean, kind of like, sometimes even the right thing to do isn't always the easy thing to do. Like I think so I totally get that. Yeah, and ultimately, I think you don't have to completely go overnight from one process to another. I think it's a matter of kind of taking that adoption slowly, and you go from I might still be doing branches, and those branches might live for a little. Maybe I try and keep them not as long lived, with the goal of eventually where I'm just kind of merging that in pretty much every day. But I might not be ready to start there, and so you don't have to go all in. I think it's just a matter of kind of figuring that out. And I've seen a lot of teams that it can be a bit of a struggle. They start very simple and maybe they flag a few things, but they don't really fundamentally change how they operate. I think it's a good way to start, but as long as you progress towards that goal of eventually using the full power of doing this and constantly merging and getting rid of those long-lived feature branches, because as you said, like, it's a pain we all know, and if you can eliminate that pain, why not?
That's awesome. Nikki, I just noticed that you actually found your own answer. It was a question about what is an HTML rewriter. But I
yes,
think
that's a Cloudflare worker thing specifically.
Right.
It's a thing.
So I hate to cut it off, but I know we're starting to get into the break, and we've got a lot of activities going on. Then, Brian, this was really illuminating. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. I know I've been pinging our engineering team that we work with most closely throughout this talk with tons of ideas for us to try. So I thank you again. This was amazing. We really appreciate you sharing everything that you know and everything that you do to share all this with the community.
Thanks, Jim.